Hi, Union Pleasant. I have a kind of a silly song for you today. I'd like you to kind of listen along and sing along too. Uh, and think about what's happening in the song, and it's about kind of fixing problems um, and asking people how to fix problems. And this is an important thing to be able to do. So, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. So what this song is about in the old days when they had wells, you can picture an old stone well, and in the top of it they would have a little pulley, right? They would raise a bucket from the bottom. It would drop a bucket down at the bottom to get water and then bring it back up. But if there's a hole in the bucket, by the time you crank it all the way up, all the water is spilled out of the bucket, and so you don't get any water, right? And so Georgie obviously went over to get some water and didn't have any. Sing it with me. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. So what do you think she says to him? Then mend it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then mend it, dear Georgie, mend it. Mend it means fix it, right? So she just tells him, fix the hole. Right? But with what shall I mend it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I mend it, dear Liza? With what? So he asks her, well, how do I mend it? What do I mend it with? So she looks around and she thinks, I gotta solve this guy's problems all the time. With straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With straw, dear Georgie, with straw. And he's not talking about a straw that you get like in a drink. Straw like that grows in a field. Big long pieces of grass. So if you could take some of this and jam it into the hole, enough straw in the hole, it should be able to hold the water in for a while. It'll get soaked, but it should work. So he says, the straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. The straw is too long, dear Liza, too long. So the pieces of straw were really long, and he didn't want all that. So she says, then cut it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then cut it, dear Georgie, cut it. What do you think he's going to say? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what? With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a knife, dear Georgie, a knife. So he gives it a try. The knife is too dull, dear Liza, dear Liza. The knife is too dull, dear Liza, too dull. So what do you think she's gonna say? Then sharpen it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then sharpen it, dear Georgie, sharpen it. With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza? With what? He doesn't seem to be able to figure out any of the solutions to any of these problems. What do you think he should sharpen it with? Of course, Liza's going to know. With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a stone, dear Georgie, with a stone. So he's supposed to sharpen the knife on a stone, like that's how you sharpen a knife. But the stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry. So when you sharpen a stone, you usually put some water or some oil on it to be able to help sharpen the stone. So she says, then wet it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then wet it, dear Georgie, wet it. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With water, dear Georgie, with water. In what shall I get it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I get it, dear Liza? With what? In the bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. In a bucket, dear Georgie, in a bucket. But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza. There's a hole. It always comes back around to the hole in the bucket. Can you think of any way they could have gotten out of this situation? Oh, in the old days, I mean. Now we would use flex tape or something, right? But boy, let's sing it together one more time and see if you can think of any other ways out of this situation. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Then mend it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then mend it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, mend it. With what shall I mend it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I mend it, dear Liza? With what? With straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With straw, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, with straw. So maybe there would have been another thing we could have mended it with. I can't think of anything, though. The straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. The straw is too long, dear Liza, too long. Then cut it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then cut it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, cut it. With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what? Cut it, cut it. Oh, could think of something else. Scissors. Could have cut it with scissors, right? But he didn't. With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a knife, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a knife. But the knife is too dull, dear Liza, dear Liza. The knife is too dull, dear Liza, too dull. Then sharpen it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then sharpen it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, sharpen it. With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza? With what? With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With a stone, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, with a stone. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry. Then wet it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. Then wet it, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, wet it. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. With water, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, with water. In what shall I get it, dear Liza, dear Liza? In what shall I get it, dear Liza? In what? In a bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, dear Georgie. In a bucket, dear Georgie, dear Georgie, in a bucket. But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. I hope you enjoyed the little song. Answer a couple questions in the Google form right after it, and have a great week, everybody.